Chapter 29. Traitors and Raiders. The first evil choice or act is linked to the second, and each one to the one that follows, both by the tendency of our evil nature and by the power of habit, which holds us as by a destiny. Tryon Edwards. In the end, the old man hadn't gone peacefully. Cooper found himself fascinated by how some people fought so hard against the inevitable, while others simply faded away. Solwyn had once talked about some Eastern religion where there was an endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. The object of the game, from how Solwyn explained it, was to get off that cycle of rebirth, somehow ascend to a higher plane of existence. He had said, "Some people are closer to that higher plane than others, so they don't fear death, they welcome it as the next step." At the last house, the bright yellow farmhouse that sat outside of the tall fence surrounding the town's cattle herd, the mother had gone quickly. In truth, after he had killed the woman's husband, she had frozen, unable to cope. The girl had struggled, but she was young, 16 or 17 at the most. No matter what horrors life had dealt, she desperately wanted to live. At the end of 3 days there at the house, the most he dared to stay, he had moved on to the old man's house, leaving the flies and blood behind for others to find. Cooper hadn't known any of the people he had killed to welcome their imminent death, but there were some who seemed to go with only a small show of resistance, while others fought tooth and nail to the bitter end. The old man had been one of the latter. Every breath he had taken was impossible, a fight against all odds as the blood pooled around him and his breaths became shallow and far apart, ending in hitched gasps. He had stared at Cooper as if he knew him, but said little. It's you. Cooper was pretty sure he had never met the old man before, but who knew? Maybe he had. Thurman Banks had taken a long time to die. Cooper had watched it with the clinical detachment that comes from not just seeing death, but dealing it out with regularity and precision. He had waited until the last rattling breath had come, and the light had died from the old man's eyes, before exiting the bedroom and shutting the door behind him. He figured that he had a day, maybe 2, before the summer heat would betray what had happened here. Meanwhile, he would have a nice nap on the living room sofa and see what there was to eat. He had tricked his way into the farmhouse, and now this old man's house, by pretending to be a trader. In reality, the items he had for sale were nothing more than the loot gathered from his previous stopovers, a trail of bodies and trauma that extended through 3 states now. A few blocks away, Jess had gone to the west garden to pull weeds and collect some tomatoes that were heavy and ready for picking. She had asked Carrie not to say anything about the pregnancy. She was still struggling with the reality of it and the complicated memories her condition brought up. There was a tiny pooch to her otherwise flat stomach, and she felt exhausted by midday, but other than that, there was nothing to indicate a child growing inside of her. Despite this, Jess knew it had to be real. Once her shock had receded, she had found herself excited at the prospect, but there was a deep sadness as well as guilt as she recalled her first pregnancy, although she reminded herself time and again that the circumstances had been drastically different. A part of her felt great guilt at not having wanted Jacob from the beginning. Those months, filled with fear and running and escape with her friend Aaron, had left a deep mark within her. She had hated the child growing inside her, actively hoped it would die, and been horrified as it had grown and thrived, taking over her body, before finally finding herself in the throes of labor and delivery. If that soldier had not thrown open the door right then, his presence reminding all of them of how close death was and how important being alive could be, would she have ever loved him? She loved Jacob now, deeply, irredeemably, even as she watched her brother's face as he struggled with the reality of his nephew's grim origins. So, in addition to feeling happiness and excitement over this new life growing inside her, Jess also felt guilt and shame at not feeling this way about Jacob. So she said nothing, hoping she could reconcile these different feelings, and also wait until she was a little further along and sure before sharing it with everyone else. A car horn sounded from the street outside the front of the house. The Jeep was obscured behind the row of corn, now over 5 feet tall in the fruit trees. The family emptied out of the house and grounds, converging on the front road. It was Todd Stevens, and his face was pinched with exhaustion, his mouth set. "Hey there, Jess." He nodded to Chris and David and the rest who had come from their work in the garden and inside the house. "We have a problem." Todd's presence at the house, along with a serious look, and the word problem raised all of the adults' hackles. Todd had been re-established as the head of the town militia after the mayor's son had made a royal mess of it, too busy riding on his wave of new power to follow the tried-and-true strategies of protecting the town from raids. Entire families had died, but the raiders had been run off over the past year, thanks to Todd's leadership. Once again, all able-bodied adults in town were required to do their part and serve on a rotating schedule for the militia. The raids had fallen off dramatically, and there hadn't been a problem in months. That, however, appeared to have changed. "It looks like the Franklin place was raided a week ago," Todd said, looking grim. The Franklin home was north off of Kentucky, outside of the outer fence. They kept pigs and chickens on their 10-acre plot and came into town every couple of weeks to trade. They were due in last week, and when they didn't show and Sarah let us know they were overdue for a delivery of chickens she had ordered, we went up there. Jess felt her heart thump in her chest. "Raiders?" Todd looked over at the kids clustered around. "Yeah, it looks like they stayed a day or two." The Franklins had 2 kids, both in their late teens. The daughter Mary had helped out a handful of times caring for Jacob and Becca when they were smaller. A sick dread spread through Jess's stomach. Todd met her eyes. "They were all gone." He said it with finality. His even tone did not betray the turmoil he had felt when faced with the reality of what he had seen. He beckoned to Chris and David. "I'll need you two to help me search. We think they are still out there." Both men were already carrying a small sidearm at their waists. Chris nodded and opened the back door, but David hesitated, staring at Jess. He didn't want to leave her, not if there was danger in the area. She caught the look and gave him one of her own that clearly said she could take care of herself. Her hand strayed to Lady, a tiny revolver that hadn't left her side in years, not since old Coop had given it to her as a gift all those years ago. Thinking about him now, she wondered if the old man was still there, raising his hunting dogs and setting traps. He had been a good man, and she could still remember the last thing he had said to her, his hand on her rounded belly. "I can't blame you, girl, if you think you hate this creature inside you, but it's a blessing, and someday you'll see it that way." Old Coop had been right. Jacob was one of the best parts of her life, and she wished she could tell the old man that. "Go," she said to David. "I'll be fine, and we have Jacob here as well." David had spent the past few summers teaching Jacob archery, how to handle a small or large firearm, and tracking techniques. Todd Stevens had taught Jacob and others hand-to-hand combat as well once he resumed control of the militia. David smiled at her, kissed her, and then he jumped into the jeep as well. "See you soon." It was nearly dark when they returned, both men grim-faced. Jess had extended the offer of dinner to Todd, but he had politely refused. His eyes haunted, saying only that his wife and kids were waiting. "Anything?" Jess asked. "No tracks past the creek," David said, his lips set. "It looks like only one guy, but we aren't 100% sure. Todd thinks he might have headed north, but I'm not convinced. I think we need to keep a sharp eye out, keep everyone close." Chris nodded. "Me too." Dinner was a muted affair, and Chris looked tense and on edge. Danger was lurking, far too close to home for anyone's comfort.